There he
Hello.
is.
Oh,
Yay.
many apologies. The change in time. I forgot you guys were in a different zone.
Thank you.
Oh, well, what can I say?
Yeah.
So we should get started, huh?
Yeah. Just for a reminder for everybody that we are recording this. And so if you want to go ahead and put yourself on mute and also turn off your video, then when we go into the question and answer period, if you could go ahead and just submit your questions into the chat, and then somebody will read off the question to give to Kent, just so we can keep things kind of organized. So thank you, Kent.
Oh, my pleasure.
Wait,
Again,
really,
huge apology.
really quick. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Janet Williams, the president of Speed City, and I just really want to thank our favorite chapter member, Lori Rader Day, for kind of giving us some really good information while we were waiting. But thank you, everybody.
All right. And hi, Lori. It's so good to see you again. I'm looking forward to the day when I can actually give you a hug once again. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about what it means to be a writer, sort of. And let me tell you where the idea for this talk came from. Before the pandemic set in, well over a year ago, I was asked to deliver the keynote at a writers' conference in Southern California. And after I had delivered my remarks and had opened it up for questions, I got a question from a young writer there. And it was a question that I'd never been asked before, which is really odd for me because after 20 years of doing these kinds of things, I thought I'd been asked every question anybody could throw at me. But this was her question. She said, "Kent, what does it mean to be a writer? What's that really like?" You know, the answer I gave her, I'm sure, was way too flippant because the truth is I'd never stopped to think about that before. But I've been doing a lot of thinking about it since. And so that's what I want to do today, is share with you some of the conclusions that I've come to as a result of my thinking. And I want to begin today by drawing some analogies with some scenes from some of my favorite movies. Now, they might not be your favorite movies, but I hope that at least you know them. Okay, so do you folks remember that terrific Humphrey Bogart, Katharine Hepburn movie, The African Queen? Toward the end of that film, there is a scene in which Bogey has a rope over his shoulder and he's slogging through this chest-deep swamp water, trying to haul the African Queen through this impenetrable wall of reeds. And he knows that while he's in that water, big black leeches are attaching themselves all over his body, and he hates leeches, who doesn't? But he knows if he wants to get himself and Hepburn and the African Queen to the place where they need to be, this is what he has to do. Well, sometimes that's what it's like to be a writer. And do you remember that scene from E.T. when the kids are bicycling like crazy to get away from the bad guys, and it looks like they're just about to be caught, and they find themselves suddenly lifted magically into the air, and they go pedaling across the face of the full moon. It's just this wonderful, magical moment of freedom and flight. Yeah, sometimes that's what it's like to be a writer. And do you remember that really enigmatic scene in 2001, A Space Odyssey? I know they're all enigmatic, but the one I'm thinking of occurs right at the beginning of the film when these early cave people find themselves standing in front of this gigantic monolith that has appeared mysteriously before them. And as they stand there looking up at that monolith, you can just tell by the look on their faces that they know it means something incredibly important, but they just can't figure out what that is. Yeah, sometimes that's what it's like to be a writer. Like a lot of you, I'm sure, I always wanted to be a writer. I mean, always. And probably like some of you, I had my first real writing moment early in my life. The first short story I remember writing was a story in the third grade. It was called The Walking Dictionary. Now, I got to tell you this, my father was a high school English teacher. And when I was a kid, he was always storming around the house, ranting something like, "Nobody uses dictionaries enough. Nobody uses dictionaries enough." So in the third grade, I wrote a short story called The Walking Dictionary, which was in fact about a dictionary that didn't think it was being used enough. It magically sprouted legs so that it could toddle off into the world and go to the people that needed it. My third grade teacher went gaga over that story. My folks oohed and awed over that story. I swear to you, in the third grade, I knew I was destined to be a writer. And from the get-go, I had some pretty grand illusions about what it meant to be a writer. And maybe the grandest illusion of all came as a result of my love affair with Ernest Hemingway. When I was 18 years old, my father, the high school English teacher, insisted that I read Hemingway, and I fell madly in love with that guy. Well, yeah, I liked his writing well enough, but what I really fell in love with was that mythic image of Ernest Hemingway that we're all familiar with. So here was this guy who fought in the Italian army in World War I before the United States really became involved in that war. They put him to work driving an ambulance. He was wounded. He got a medal for it. After that, he hung out in Paris with all the great names of the lost generation. He was a legendary brawler, drinker, big game hunter, hung out with matadors. And he'd been given the Nobel Prize in Literature for writing a kind of fiction nobody had ever written before. When I was 18 years old, I wanted to be Ernest Hemingway. And I spent way too long trying to write the great American novel as Ernest Hemingway might have written it. Stupid on so many levels. You know, there are all kinds of goofy images floating around out there about what it means to be a writer. And we know a lot of them. You know, there's that image of the driven writer, maybe think Jack Kerouac here, pounding away furiously on his keyboard late into the night, fueled by speed, composing all of On the Road on one long continuous roll of paper. Or the tortured writer struggling through the dark night of her soul, maybe think Sylvia Plath here. Or the disillusioned writer, Minnesota's own F. Scott Fitzgerald, chief among them, drinking himself into oblivion and praying desperately for the return of the muse. Probably most of us who are writers have spent time trying on at least one of these images to see how well they fit. Well, I really have only one concrete piece of advice that I'm going to offer you this afternoon, and here it is. Fuck Hemingway. Forget about Fitzgerald and Kerouac and Plath. Don't waste your time trying to write like somebody else. Your time is going to be so much better spent discovering the unique writer you can be. So I can't really stand up here telling you what it's like to be a writer. I can only tell you what it's like for me to be a writer. And so I'm going to let you in on one or two of the things that work for me. But with this caveat, it's what works for me. And I'm only offering it as a counterpoint to all those goofy romantic images, notions of what it is to be a writer that are floating around out there. So one of the things it means to me to be a writer is to be disciplined. I think if you're an artist, I don't care what your medium is, if you're going to accomplish anything in your art, you have to approach it in a disciplined way. In my case, my alarm clock for the last 40 plus years has gone off at 5:45 every morning, 7 days a week. I have gotten myself up and dressed, and I've gone to a coffee shop. Well, before we had to shelter in place because of the pandemic, I would go to a coffee shop where I would spend the first 1 to sometimes even 3 hours of the day writing. It's a discipline that began for me for a very practical reason. Um, I began about more than 40 years ago when my wife entered law school. And I suddenly became the sole support of our family. I was the guy who had to, keep a roof over her head and food on the table. But I wanted desperately to be a writer. And so if I was going to meet my responsibilities as a family man and still develop as a writer, I had to come up with a way to do that. And honestly, it was Hemingway who showed me the way. One of the things I knew about Papa is that he loved nothing more than to rise at first light and spend the first 2 hours of every day writing. He thought it was the most creative time of the day. We were living at that point 2 blocks from this iconic cafe here in St. Paul, a place called the St. Clair Broiler, that opened its doors at 6 o'clock every morning. So I pitched this idea to my wife. I said, Diane, if you're willing to get the kids up and dressed and fed and off to school so I can go write first thing, I promise you, when I come home from my job at the end of the day, I will be the best husband, the best father you can possibly imagine. She bought it. So there I was at 6 o'clock every morning, 7 days a week, with my pen and notebook in hand. Pen and notebook because this was long before we had laptops. They would seat me in booth number 4, always booth number 4. They saved it for me. And they would pour me my coffee. I would open my notebook and pick up my pen. And from 6 until 7:15, I would write. At 7:15, I closed my notebook, I paid for my coffee, and I went out front of the broiler where at 7:20, a bus picked me up and took me to the university where I was working. I still follow that regime today, rising before 6 o'clock every day, 7 days a week. It has done two important things for me. First of all, it's established the discipline that, as I've told you, I think is so important if you're a writer. But it's done something else for me that's even more important to me as a writer, and here it is. If I get up first thing in the morning and write, I'm feeding something in me that is elemental to who I am, something that needs to be fed. And then in return gives me the energy to go out into the world and give whatever I have to give to it in order to keep a roof over our head and food on the table, because I fed this very important thing inside me. Writing for me has become the way I center myself in every day and create the energy to go out and meet the world. Now, I told you that I've always written. But, I didn't publish my first novel until I was almost 48 years old. I served a very long apprenticeship. But, when I look back on all of those years, I never think of a single moment of it as wasted, because every day I was doing what I loved most in the world, first thing. I want to tell you a story now that I've always thought of as a hopeful story about doing what you love and persevering, and what it means to me to be a writer. So in my early 40s, after having tried to write the great American novel a la Ernest Hemingway, in vain, I decided it was finally time to write something somebody might actually want to read. So I looked around me to see what everybody reads. You know what everybody reads? They read mysteries. It's a genre whose appeal cuts across all socioeconomic levels. So I decided I'm going to write a mystery. And I spent the next 4 years doing that. When I finished the manuscript for what would become my first published novel, Iron Lake, the first in my Cork O'Connor series, I did what you were supposed to do back then. This was back in the mid-1990s. I sent query letters to 36 New York agents. New York, heart of the publishing business. I got 6 replies. All of them were form letters saying, no, thank you very much. Now, the level of uninterest in my work was clearly communicated to me, because all of these form letters were Xeroxed, and 2 of them had been Xeroxed crooked on the page. But about that same point in time, some friends of mine who also wanted to be mystery writers attended a writers' conference in Chicago. Those of you who remember of Dark and Stormy Nights, it was of Dark and Stormy Nights. And they came back from that conference and they said, we have your agent. The keynote speaker that year was a woman named Jane Jordan Brown, who had a literary agency in Chicago. And Jane's speech was, how do you get an agent? My friends brought me back a tape of Jane's talk. And when I listened to it, it seemed to me Jane wasn't telling these authors, this is how you get just any old agents. She was saying, this is how you get me, Jane Jordan Brown, as your agent. And when I listened really carefully to her tape, it seemed like what she was suggesting to those writers was, if you want to get me, Jane Jordan Brown, as your agent, you need to say something very nice about me in your query letter. So I spent a couple of weeks coming up with a great compliment to pay Jane. I opened my query letter with it. And 2 weeks later, I got a call from Jane saying, I want to see your manuscript. I sent the manuscript to Jane and she got back to me in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. That's a really fast turnaround time. That's a sign of a good agent. But Jane said, I'm not going to represent you. Your manuscript is too long. It was 500 pages. She said, I can't sell a first novel this long, but if you're willing to cut it by 100 pages, I'll be happy to look at it again. 100 pages. That was like asking me to cut off my right arm. But if that's what it was going to take, that's what I was going to do. So I reeled it back in, and over the course of the next year, I actually cut it by 120 pages. I sent it back to Jane. She said, this is exactly what I was looking for. I will represent you. Let's go. In November of that particular year, Jane sent my manuscript to 6 of the largest New York publishing houses with this very bold demand. Do you want to publish Kent's work? Give us an answer by Christmas. Now, what I didn't understand about the publishing business is that nothing happens at Christmas. For 2 weeks before Christmas and 2 weeks after Christmas, they all leave the city. They go to the Poconos or the Berkshires or Florida, wherever they go for vacation, and kind of the publishing business rolls to a halt. So Christmas rolls around. We haven't heard anything. New Year's rolls around. We still haven't heard anything. I still remember this really bleak night in the middle of January. I'm sitting at the kitchen table. My wife, Diane, is beside me trying to console me. I've got my head in my hands and I'm whining something like, nobody wants my work. Nobody wants my work. Well, I get a call from Jane the next day, or it might have been the day after that, saying, somebody wants your work. She explained that it was an offer from St. Martin's Press, one of the large, fine imprints in New York City. She explained that it was a first author contract, not a lot of money, but somebody wanted my work. I said, wonderful, Jane. Where do I sign? And Jane said, you're not going to sign because I think you're going to get another offer. The next day we got another offer. It was from Simon and Schuster, and it was a much better offer. And I said, wonderful, Jane, where do I sign? And she said, you're not going to sign because I've called St. Martin's and told them about Simon and Schuster's offer. I think they'll make a counteroffer. The next day we got a counteroffer from St. Martin's. They said, not only will we pay him more for Iron Lake, we know he's at work on another novel. We'll buy that one too. I said, wonderful, Jane. Where do I sign? And Jane said, you're not going to sign because I've called Simon and Schuster and told them about St. Martin's offer. I think they'll make a counteroffer. And the next day we got a 2-book counteroffer from Simon and Schuster that was so lucrative, we couldn't turn it down. It's every writer's dream that a bidding war will break out between powerful New York publishing houses for the right to your work. For me, that happened with my first novel. So one of the things that it has always meant to me to be a writer is to live in hope. Because I'm here to tell you, sometimes your deepest dreams do come true. But there's a flip side, and here it is. Sometimes what it means to be a writer is to accept that failure is also a part of the journey that you're on. Here's the story. About 12 years ago, 13 years ago now, a story idea came to me that wasn't a Cork O'Connor story. And when I proposed that project to my publisher, they didn't want it. In fact, they called me out to New York City in kind of a panic and set me down and said, Kent, we only want Cork O'Connor novels from you. So I knew if I wrote this piece, it was going to be a risky proposition, but it was a story that spoke to me in such a compelling way that I knew I had to write it. And so across the course of the next 3 years, I composed the manuscript for a novel called Ordinary Grace. Now, even though my publisher had indicated they didn't want the manuscript, when it was finished, I went ahead and sent it to my editor at Simon & Schuster. She fell in love with it and she said, of course, we're going to publish it. And they did. And Ordinary Grace has had just this really remarkable, really gratifying reception from critics and readers alike. It won tons of awards when it came out. It's been translated into more than 24 foreign languages. So far, it's sold to more than 1 million copies. And when my publisher saw how well that book was doing, boy, did they want another book just like it. So I signed a contract for a companion novel to Ordinary Grace. They paid me a shitload of money. And I spent the next few years writing what I thought would be the companion novel to Ordinary Grace. Now, that manuscript was contractually due to my publisher almost 6 years ago. 2 months before that contractual deadline, I set up a meeting in Chicago to talk to my agent about revisions to the piece because there were problems with it. I knew it, she knew it. 2 days before we got together, I sent her a note saying, when we meet, I don't want to talk about how we revise this piece. I want to talk about how we keep it from being published. Because it wasn't the story I thought it would be. I had no idea how to make it that story. And frankly, my heart wasn't in it. So here's the deal. If you're a writer, I think you need to think of yourself as an artist. I don't care what kind of a writer you think yourself to be, whether it's a mystery writer or a romance writer or a writer of speculative fiction or a literary writer. I think we all need to think of ourselves as artists, and words are our medium. And if we really do this, if we really think of ourselves as artists, then we ought to always be trying to grow in our art. We ought to always be pushing our boundaries. And if we do that, what it means is very often we're going to be out there walking a dangerous edge. And if we do that, what it means is that we are sometimes going to be risking a fall. I fell. Then the question I had to ask myself is, did I fail? And I have to tell you honestly, I've never thought of that experience as failure. For me, it's simply another place that I have visited in this journey that I'm on as a writer. But something really remarkable came as a result of that whole experience. So my publisher was really, very understanding. They said, fine, you don't have to give us this manuscript, but you still owe us a companion novel. Now, when I was writing that piece, the expectations for that follow-up novel were enormous. And the whole time I was trying to write the story, I felt crushed by the weight of all those expectations. But as soon as my publisher said, that's fine, you don't have to give us this manuscript, and all those expectations got lifted off my shoulders, I felt free again. And I saw so clearly the story I should have been writing, the story that spoke to me from my heart. And I got to tell you, honestly, it's a story that I've wanted to write since I was 11 years old. When I was 11, that would have been in the 5th grade. Toward the end of that year, our teacher read to the class The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. She did it by reading half an hour after lunch every day. I love that story. I love that book. Here was this kid, and he was just like me. And he was out there on the Mississippi River having these really great adventures. And of course, after that, I had to read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which I loved even more. And I swear to God, across my entire career as a writer, I have wanted someday to write a story that would pay homage to Mark Twain, that might be in its own way an updated version of Huckleberry Finn. And that's where my latest novel, This Tender Land, came from. And I don't know if you know this, but This Tender Land spent 6 months among the top 10 on the New York Times bestseller list. So I do have another piece of advice for you. As a writer, there are going to be all kinds of voices speaking to you about what you ought to be writing, what's hot, what's going to sell, all of that. I think you shouldn't pay any attention to those voices. I think the only voice you should be listening to is the one that speaks to you from your own heart. When I used to teach writing, the first thing I would say to my students was this: if you're here because you think it's going to be really cool to call yourself a writer, or you think you're going to be rich and famous as a result of it, I can almost guarantee that you're going to be disappointed. But if you're here because writing is what you love to do, because it's what your heart tells you you have to do, then I can almost guarantee a different experience. And I think in the end, it's not going to matter whether you become rich and famous, because what you will have done is spent your life following your passion. And what could be better than that? But I also told my students this: if you're true to that journey, eventually you're going to discover the writer you were always meant to be, and you'll be writing the stories you were always meant to write. And that's when the doors will open for you. So what does it mean to me to be a writer? What's that really like? Do you remember that terrific final scene from that great Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life? When George Bailey is running through the streets of his small town, his heart's so full of joy because he's just been shown what the world would have been like if he hadn't been born. And he finally understands that the life he's living, despite all its disappointments and all of its difficulties, is the life he was always meant to live. Yeah. That's what it means to me to be a writer. Thanks very much for listening. Now, I think we're going to move on to some questions. Am I correct?
You are. Thank you, Kent. That was so inspiring. It really
Oh,
was.
good.
Definitely. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and then we'll be given to them. I think there was one. Just this is from Lori. From everything I am learning about publishing, I'm surprised with what seems an inability to move books quickly. I am in my late 50s and trying to publish first time on a timely topic, regardless of whether my book is good or bad. No. Oh, sorry, I just lost. Good or bad. It seems like publishing isn't meant for my work. Is the industry not meant for new authors on timely topics? Thank you.
Yeah. You know, the truth about publishing is that it's a Zen exercise in patience. Nothing happens really quickly. And so, I just read a novel about the coronavirus written by Mary Alice Monroe. And it is about the coronavirus written in real time. And it's coming out now, but she finished that novel some time ago. Um, it's, well, first of all, it's really difficult to break into publishing anyway, at any level, at any time. But to try to break into publishing with something that's important right now, if you're going to try to do the traditional publishing route, may be next to impossible. So I think what you need to do is consider alternatives. And I'm not sure I agree with your whether my novel is good or bad, or my work is good or bad. I think you should never publish something that you don't believe is good. I think you always ought to try to put out there the very best of whatever you can do, um, and try to do it, I guess, in a timely way in your case. But you can there are so many platforms for self-publishing. Maybe that's a reasonable route to consider. There are smaller publishing houses who might be able to turn around something faster, and maybe you could consider that. I don't really have a lot of advice in terms of how to shortcut that whole process, honestly.
Thank you. While we're waiting for a few more questions, so this is Carol Paddock. I'm Vice President of the chapter. When I first heard of you as an author, I was at Rainy Day Books in Kansas City, and I was looking for mysteries. And the woman there said, "Oh, if you're interested in books where place and location is a character, you need to try to read William Kent Krueger." And so I bought your first two books of the Cork O'Connor series and loved them. And definitely location is a big character with that. I have noticed your new book that's coming out, Lightning Strikes. I was kind of surprised at the title because it didn't quite fall into the other locations, particularly with the Cork O'Connor series. So I just thought, could you say something about that and why you
Yeah,
came up with that title?
yeah, it's clear that you haven't read the novel because Lightning Strike is a place. An important place
Okay.
in the book. For those of you who don't know, kind of the shtick around my Cork O'Connor series, all what will be 18 books now this summer in the series are two-word place names: Iron Lake, Boundary Waters, Purgatory Ridge, etc. And Lightning Strike is a place that's important in the story. And it's also, one of the things I like about that two-word place name is that I can riff off that title, and work the theme of the story into it. And one of the themes of the story in Lightning Strike is how quickly things can change. They can change in an instant, just like a lightning strike. So there you go.
Great. Well, that's good to know. Just seeing it, I didn't think that. So
Yeah. It's for those of you who might be interested in the upcoming Cork O'Connor novel. It's a prequel to the Cork O'Connor series. If you're familiar with my series, you know that my protagonist, Cork O'Connor, was sheriff of the fictional Tamarack County when Cork was a kid, and Cork's father was killed in the line of duty when Cork was 13 years old. Lightning strike takes Cork in the summer before his father is killed. And what it, there's really a good kick-ass, two good kick-ass mysteries at the heart of the story, but it's really an opportunity for me to explain the important relationship father and son had with each other, or the important relationship Cork had with his mother, the relationship his parents had with each other, these important relationships that helped shape Cork into the man who occupies center stage in the series. And it can be read as a standalone. You don't have to know anything about the Cork O'Connor series in order to enjoy this story.
Good. Okay. We have another one. Well,
I see one right now from Lori that says,
yeah.
how has the pandemic changed my writing regime? Lori, it hasn't really changed it at all. I feel a little guilty. I know so many people have suffered so greatly as a result of the pandemic, but I have not. I simply exchanged my kitchen counter for the coffee shop. I still get up at 6:45 or 5:45 every morning and spend the first 2 or 3 hours writing. I'm married to the world's most wonderful woman. She has promised to stay in bed every day until I finished my writing. But I have been incredibly productive during the pandemic period. And I think it's because there were so many other distractions that weren't present, and I was really able to focus on my writing. Or it could be that I just channeled all of my concerns, all of my emotions, all of my every energy into the writing itself. Lori, if you're willing to come on and speak to the same question, I would love to hear how the pandemic has influenced your writing or affected your writing up at this point.
Hey, Kent.
Hi.
Hey, I did a tight 20 on querying before you showed up. My pandemic experience has been interesting. I was in the early stages of my next project and needed to rewrite it entirely. That was actually my decision, not my editor's decision. And so the early days of the pandemic, the way I dealt with everything was I just went to that book and that's where I lived. I lived inside the project and rewrote it between early March to July 1st. That's all I did. And so then July 1st, I had a minor meltdown, realizing, what the rest of the world looked like still. Puzzles and Great British Baking. That's how I got through that portion of the pandemic.
Yeah. So where are you now? Have you essentially recovered your artistic energy and moving forward and looking toward the future brightly?
I don't know that I can say I've recovered, but I did get that project rewritten 3 times. Well, I rewrote it twice. I wrote it again. Again, that was me, not my editor. And then turned it in and did all my copy edits over the holidays, and it's being published in October. In fact, I can hook you up with an ARC if you'd like one, Ken.
I would love an ARC. Thank you. And what's the title?
It is called Death at Greenway. Before you were here, I told them about it's set at Agatha Christie's holiday home during World War II.
Oh my gosh. Intriguing as all get out.
It is my white whale project, Ken. And the reason why I was asking, one of my questions that I don't think you've asked yet, you talked about how your agent or maybe your editor was the one who was like, we don't want anything but Cork books from you. I don't have a series, but I have a certain kind of book. And I'm curious if you had readers, if you had Cork fans who were like, we don't want anything but Cork from you. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. One of the reasons that my publisher had said we only want Cork O'Connor novels from you is the 4th novel I wrote was my very first standalone. I wrote it many, many years ago. It's a political thriller called The Devil's Bed, which sold more poorly than any of my Cork O'Connor novels, which is why my publisher was not eager to see something that wasn't Cork. And it was, seriously, I think it's a really good thriller. But readers were unwilling to follow me to a place that didn't have Cork O'Connor in it. And so with that experience under my belt, for 2 years before Ordinary Grace was going to be published, every event that I did, and I do lots of events, I prepared the audience. I said, in 2 years, a book is going to be coming out that is not a Cork O'Connor novel, but you need to read it. It's really good. And it worked. I still had people write to me and said, I picked up Ordinary Grace thinking it was a Cork O'Connor novel, and I was disappointed until I read the story. And I love Ordinary Grace. So yeah, it's been like that. And had the same response with This Tender Land. Oh, it's not a Cork O'Connor? Oh my God, it's a good story. So yeah, no, for me, it was just a lot of prep of my readership in advance. And now, of course, I have so many readers who've come to my work who typically wouldn't read mysteries, but Ordinary Grace or This Tender Land, it was a book club read or it was recommended to them. They've read it. And I get emails from them all the time saying, I loved This Tender Land or I loved Ordinary Grace, so I decided to give your Cork O'Connor series a try. I love Cork O'Connor. So, there's that cross feeding that has helped enormously.
Here's another one. Do you have any craft talks on YouTube?
I do not, that I'm aware of. I often, when I do a talk, I often give permission for it to be videotaped. Typically, I ask for it not to be posted on YouTube because I don't want to divulge all of my secrets to the world. But you may, in fact, find one out there, but not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Will you be doing another standalone?
Yeah. So Lightning Strike comes out this August. I have finished the next novel in my Cork O'Connor series, a novel that will be called Jawbone Creek, that will be out in the fall of 2022. And this summer, I turn all of my energy to the writing of my next standalone, which will be a companion novel to both This Tender Land and Ordinary Grace. Companion in that, like those books, it will be set in southern Minnesota rather than the northern Minnesota of my Cork O'Connor series, and companion in that, like Ordinary Grace, which takes place in the summer of 1961, and This Tender Land, which takes place in the summer of 1932, it will be set in an earlier time. And it will, I'm sure, deal with many of the same themes that I've dealt with in both of those novels. I have no title for it yet.
What is your relationship with the Native American community? Is it generally supportive? I imagine you have sources that you go to for background information, etc.
Yeah, I have been working with the Native community here in Minnesota for more than 2 decades now as a result of my Cork O'Connor series. And I have friends inside the Ojibwe community who I go to for their expertise, their advice. Whenever I have a manuscript finished in my Cork O'Connor novel, I will give it at least two of my Ojibwe friends to vet for me, so that I haven't said anything that's too stupid or even worse, offensive. So yes, and the response, at least from those who have contacted me, has been nothing but positive. So I received this email a while back, but it's kind of typical of the emails that I get from the Native community. Dear Mr. Krueger, I am the tribal librarian on the Lance Reservation, which is in the UP of Michigan. When any of our members come in and they're not sure what they want to read, I always recommend your work, because for a white guy, you do a pretty good job. I'm always painfully aware that I'm a white guy trespassing on a culture not my own. I have no native blood in me whatsoever. So I work very hard at getting it right. And I work very hard at portraying the Ojibwe community in a way that I hope will shatter a lot of the stereotypes that are still held by people everywhere.
Another one. After having to reduce your first novel by 120 pages, do you now try to write tighter novels? I.e., once you're done with your first draft, are you adding or taking away while rewriting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And for me, editing consists primarily of what to take out. What really does the reader not not have to know? What really can the reader figure out for him or herself? What have I repeated? What information have I repeated that the reader already has in his or her thinking, and I don't need to go over it again? You know, all of those kinds of things. It is 90% taking away and maybe 10% adding some clarification to certain things. But I think for most writers, it is a question of what not to put in. In fact, that was what was important about Iron Lake, my first novel. What I pulled out of that story was all backstory, and it slowed the pace of the story tremendously. And so I took all of that backstory out and I spread it across the first 3 novels in the series. And so by the end of that 3rd novel, we had all of the backstory for all of the important characters. And you know, pacing it out that way kept the stories moving quickly and kept readers intrigued as they learned more and more about the characters involved.
I think this is a comment from Maryland. I recently moved from Indiana to St. Paul, Minnesota to help take care of my only grandchild. I feel that I have missed out on the Minnesota magic. I am drawn to the Mississippi River, and the Native American population is present here, but somehow mostly in the shadows. I am eager to explore, but I don't really know how to start. I haven't found St. Paul to be very welcoming. I'm sure it's the pandemic.
Yeah, I'm sure it's the pandemic as well. I love St. Paul. I find it a very small town, even though it's 800,000 people. There are wonderful neighborhoods here, and people tend to be extremely friendly in Minnesota in general. You know, you walk down the street, most people are going to say hello to you, which is hard to do if you're masked and you're afraid you're going to get the coronavirus from one another. So I would say give it a chance, particularly as the summer progresses and the mask mandate is lifted. You will find Minnesota to be much more welcoming. And stay through the summer and walk the Mississippi River. We have beautiful trails on either side of the Mississippi River. There is, if you're interested in the Native community and influence here, there are some tours that you can arrange to take that will take you to the sacred sites in the Twin Cities. They're important to particularly the Dakota, but also the Ojibwe people here. You're absolutely right in that here in an urban setting, the Native population tends to exist in the shadows. But more and more that is becoming not true. And we are seeing the Ojibwe culture, the Ojibwe arts, all of the beauty of the Ojibwe and other Native cultures beginning to find their way into public awareness.
This is a comment from Elizabeth. Would you say your theme song might be Pretty Fly for a white guy?
I love that. If you write the song, I'll put it on my website. Or is it
That could be
already
the
a
title.
song? Is it already a song?
Yes, it is already a
think so.
song.
Okay.
Yes,
Well, that
it
shows
is.
how out of touch I am.
Shows you what some of us know.
Well, I'm just an old white guy. What can I say?
That could also be your autobiography whenever you decide to write it, your memoir.
And Lori Raider Day had posted in the chat a couple links to Kent's, a couple of Kent's talks that he's done for Sisters in Crime, and just wanted to remind everybody there are lots of writing talks in the archive for Sisters in Crime National, and she's posted the link there. Are there more questions?
Are you
I
going to be?
I have a question for all of you in the Indianapolis area. Those of you who ever attended Magna Cum Murder, do you have any idea if Catherine or anybody associated with that wonderful conference has plans of reviving it once the pandemic is behind us?
Janet, do you want to take that, or?
Understand it. I don't know a whole lot about it, but in October there's going to be a new event that's going to be sponsored by the Columbia Club. And Diana, is Catherine Kennison still involved with it? I don't know a ton about
Well,
it.
I have seen her comment on things that Shelley Gage has posted advertising or trying to recruit people to attend. I think it's going to be in the same format as Magna was. And I think Catherine might be peripherally involved. I know the speakers that she has that are lined up for this coming one are the same ones that were supposed to be at the next Magna that got canceled. So I'm sure she's involved somewhere, but I don't think she's running the whole thing.
Does it have a name that
Yeah,
I
it's
could
Called,
tap into
Prime
on the internet?
Yeah.
What was it?
Prime. And yeah, she's been putting stuff on Facebook. So you might find it there.
I
Okay,
think it's Prime Crime at the Columbia Club.
okay.
So,
Catchy.
yeah.
Well, I just want to say thanks for the invitation to speak with everybody at Sisters in Crime. One of the things that I had thought about saying is simply, there are all kinds of challenges facing us as writers, but among the positive things out there are organizations like Sisters in Crime that you're a part of. There are so many wonderful stories about how Sisters in Crime has helped its membership publish, promote, and connect. So congratulations, all of you who are sisters and those of us who are, what are we, misters in crime?
Mr. Sisters.
Mr.
Mr. Sisters.
There we go.
Siblings. You're all
There we
siblings.
go. Okay, siblings. So thank you very much. Everybody keep writing and keep hopeful, and hope to see you in person down the road somewhere. And Lori, I look forward to being once again able to give you a big hug. Take care, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
So, thank you.
And we want to just thank everybody that had come in that are not members of our Speed City Sisters in Crime. We're really glad that you were able to join us and hang in there to hear Kent speak. And so again, if you're interested in our chapter or any of our other events, you can go to speedcitysistersincrime.org. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.